In the first video, we mentioned the fact that innovation represented a supply-side driver of industry change. In this second video, we will now focus on innovation and discuss a little bit more the types of innovation and their impact on industry change. Clayton Christensen, in his work in the late 90s, described two different types of innovation which drive industry change, and it's often a useful framework to think about. The first is a sustaining innovation, and we can think about this as an incremental change where the product or service is continuing to basically offer the same things, but things get a little bit better. So in computers, the processor speeds get a little bit faster, and maybe the storage gets a little bit bigger, and maybe the screen gets a little bit smaller, but these are minor changes along the same trajectory, and we see slight improvements in quality. In contrast, a disruptive innovation is something where we see an entire change in the nature of the product or service or the business model. So for example, if we think about higher education, the idea of distance education and online degrees represents a completely different business model to deliver education, and that represents a potentially disruptive innovation. What makes it disruptive is it provides different features. And initially, these features often have lower initial functionality and a lower price point, also lower cost, relative to the industry incumbents. However, eventually, improvements in those features start to attract consumers and buyers from the incumbent industry. And so initially, the market opportunity for this disruptive innovation tends to be fairly small and doesn't really attract the players in the industry. But then over time, it does shift and starts to attract customers and steal market share. And then the incumbents in the industry are forced to react, very similar to the higher ed industry, where initially online education was not really paid much attention to. And now we start to see it really the incumbents, the colleges and universities are now having to adapt and develop online platforms, whereas before it was sort of not really focused on because it was a small part of the market. This graph represents what Clayton Christensen was talking about with the idea of disruptive innovation. The first thing to focus on is the black dotted line in the middle. That represents the performance demands that customers want from a product or service. The red line represents where the industry is, and so you can see on the left it starts, but then it continues an upward trajectory over time, but eventually it overshoots customer needs. In other words, the product innovations, the incremental improvements, eventually overshoot what the market actually needs. As a result, it leaves a gap. And what happens here is the blue represents the disruptive innovation, where initially the disruptive innovation offers features that are below what the market wants. But over time, as this disruptive innovation is improved, it starts to then creep into and eventually surpass what the market wants. And this is the danger with disruptive innovations, is while initially they may start below what people demand, as improvements are made and as customers start to give feedback and producers start to incorporate that feedback, eventually this disruptive innovation better meets what the market wants. And thus you can see, because of that gap between the sustaining innovation overshooting customer needs and the disruptive innovation meeting customer needs, and oftentimes that disruptive innovation is working from a lower cost basis, we start to see customers shift. And this is part of the reason that incumbents struggle, is because they're so focused on sustaining innovations that they miss the disruptive innovation. Delving a little deeper into this problem of incumbents missing disruptive innovations, there are two main issues here. The first one is that in terms of the market, initially the disruptive innovation focuses on a market that may be too small to attract their attention. Because the incumbents tend to be larger, they are looking for larger target markets which are more profitable, and also the greater uncertainty involved with these new products or services. As a result, incumbents may ignore the market for a while until it's too late. Then there are organizational constraints inside incumbents that also limit disruptive innovation adoption. That's because traditional resource allocation processes and emotional attachments in politics are focused on the mainstream market and sustaining innovations, and they often ignore what apparently starts outside of their focus because it's below what the customers want. And so they ignore it until it's too late. And as a result, incumbents tend to be slow to adapt, providing an opportunity for new innovative firms to provide disruptive innovations which eventually steal the market. delving a little deeper into organizational inertia, what ends up happening is the capabilities and the activities that we discussed with competitive strategies become traps and rigidities because they now are locked into a particular type of product or service based on their competitive position. In addition, those organizational structures and policies are designed around that position, and internally there are pressures to conform and to not sway too far from their core markets. This consistency that is so important in defining and protecting a unique competitive position actually becomes a constraint. In addition, in their competitive analysis, they may not look at other markets. All of these result in it becomes very difficult for existing firms to make major changes, and therefore they struggle to see the potential damage from disruptive innovations, and even when they see it, they have trouble adapting to it. This inertia makes it very difficult for organizations to change, and that's why we start to see industry upheavals where entire large players such as a Sears or an IBM are struggling to stay when new competitors emerge. This raises the question of how can organizations adapt successfully, and Christensen's later work then goes on to discuss this process. And one of the best things that organizations can do is when they start to see new potential innovations that don't meet the current market needs but hold potential future promise, to split these units out, create new units or divisions that are going to look at these new innovations in these new markets and have them have their own decision making, give them broad targets and give them the flexibility to organize differently and have different policies and procedures to pursue these innovations. By separating them from the existing organization, they free them from the politics and from the resource requirements and resource allocation processes and allow them to pursue different potential future paths. The other thing they can also do is to try and use their own actions to try and shape the industry towards their favor and maybe influence customer demand towards these new innovations that they see as potentially promising that they have a core competency in. But the goal is to help these organizations adapt to these new innovations without getting caught by surprise, and therefore this will allow them to survive into the future and prosper.